Hello, everyone. Good day. It's me again. I'm Sir Kyle David V. Atienza from Marinduque. As you may have noticed, I have posted a separate report on the influencing factors of distance education and other related concepts. But earlier this morning, I was informed by one of our classmates that the objectives indicated in the revised Module 2 as posted in our course is different from the objectives included in our course manual. And uh, I have noticed that my previous report is included in Module 1 and not in Module 2. That's also, I think, somehow why I thought uh, Group 1 has included my report in their discussion. But nonetheless, in my previous report, is still relevant to this topic that I will discuss today, which is on the distance education pedagogies through the generations. So for this report, we have the following objectives. First, to differentiate the three main distance education pedagogies through the generations. Next is to identify the phases of instruction or themes of every distance education pedagogy. And third, to determine the strengths and weaknesses of every distance education pedagogy. We have here the three distance education pedagogies, uh, which are embedded in the development of distance education as discussed by my group mates. And unlike their report, which primarily focused on the technology developed through the years, this report will now analyze and focus on the pedagogies that defines the learning experiences encapsulated in our learning designs. So although these pedagogies can be used in the conventional type of learning or the face-to-face classes, this report will still provide emphasis on how these pedagogies are utilized in distance education. But nonetheless, I will still provide bits of information on how these pedagogies are utilized in the conventional type of learning. As reported by my group mates, we can divide the timeline on the development of distance education based on the technology that arose from uh, those periods. So, from the first generation of distance education, we can say that the postal correspondence is the very first technology utilized for distance education. This was also mentioned in my previous report regarding the correspondence study. This was followed by the second generation, defined by mass media of television, radio, and film production. And our third generation of distance education was introduced to us through the interactive technologies like the web and immersive teleconferencing applications like Zoom, Google Meet, and Microsoft Teams. So since these three pedagogies arose in different eras and are arranged in chronological order, I have labeled them from first to third generation. But as in generations of technology, none of these pedagogies has disappeared. We can say that the newer pedagogies the has built upon on the previous pedagogies and are just trying to uh, provide solutions to issues and concerns that have appeared from the previous pedagogies. So, in an attempt to define a middle ground between either technological or pedagogical determinism, Anderson in 2019 has intertwined these concepts through a dance where the technology sets the beat and creates the music while the pedagogies defines the moves. So, every time na merong lumalabas na technology, we are to assume that another pedagogy of distance education will prevail. So, our first pedagogy of distance education is cognitive behaviorist. Cognitive and behaviorist pedagogies focus on the way in which learning was predominantly defined, practiced, and researched in the latter half of the 20th century. Behavioral learning theory begins with the notions of learning, which are generally defined as new behaviors or changes in behaviors that are acquired as a result of an individual's response to stimuli. Di ba in our teaching and learning process, sometimes the educator or the teacher provides rewards and recognition to learners. So these are the types of stimuli. We have positive stimulus, we have negative stimulus, and based from those stimulus, our learners can also provide positive and negative feedbacks. Cognitive pedagogy arose partially in response to a growing need to account for motivation, attitudes, and mental barriers that may only be partially associated with or demonstrated through observable behaviors. If you are a teacher, if you are practicing education in public schools, uh, you may have noticed that some of our learners are interested in topics where uh, they feel that they are connected or that they can uh, assimilate an experience through that topic. So ito yung pinaparating ng cognitive behaviors na the way that we learn is correlated to how our experiences or how our emotions are connected to these topics. So this type of pedagogy can be associated with our first generation of distance education technology, which was through postal correspondence. This is the linear and structure phases of cognitive behaviors pedagogies, which is also utilized in the conventional type of learning. So first, we begin with gaining the learner's attention. If this is in the face-to-face classes, ang pag-gain ng learner attention is by presenting a stimulus or by using the part of the motivation in our lesson plans. This may also uh, be included in the drills para makatch lang natin yung attention ng ating learners. In distance education, we first have to gain the learner's attention kasi kung hindi natin makukuha yung attention ng bata sa una pa lang, in succeeding phases of this pedagogy, hindi na natin may ensure na matututunan ni bata yung lesson natin. Next is to inform learner of the objectives, which is very important in all types of pedagogies and learning. Na dapat talaga alam na ng bata kung ano yung objectives at the end of this lesson. Just like in this report, nagsimula din ako by presenting the objectives of this report. Next is to stimulate recall of the previous lesson. Ito yung pag sa face-to-face ay yung review na tinatawag natin. Next is to present a stimulus material. For distance education utilized in the Department of Education in the pandemic years, yung ating self-learning modules are also arranged in this type of linear and structured phases. Provide learner guidance, or this is the guided practice. Kung aware din kayo on the structure of self-learning modules of the Department of Education, nagsisimula siya in a catchphrase muna, and then the module will present the objectives. Merong 5 to 10 items on the review. And then biglang magkakameron ng parang story or any eye-catching content dun sa module to catch the attention of the learner. And then magpuproceed na agad siya to guided practice. After ng guided practice natin, we now have to move to our independent practice or in eliciting the performance of the learner. After the individual performance of the learner, the educator must now provide feedback dun sa learner. And then we will proceed to the assessment or the evaluation of the performance. In distance education or in correspondence study, this may be in the form of a uh, 5 to 10 item quiz just to gauge the learning of the student. And then, lastly, is to enhance transfer opportunities. Kailangan na ngayong may apply ni bata in real world situations yung kanyang natutunan. In face-to-face classes, this is in the form of assignment, either follow-up assignment or future assignments. In addition to this, much research using this model, the cognitive behaviors pedagogy, proceeded from empirical testing of multimedia effects, cognitive overload, redundancy, chunking, short and long-term memory, and other mental or cognitive processes related to learning. Gaya nung nabanggit ko kanina na if nare-relate ni bata yung topic sa kanyang previous experiences, this is most likely to be stored in his or her long-term memory. Kasi 'di ba yun yung one of our mental processes na kapag naiko-correlate natin yung learning natin to our experiences, mas tumatagal siya sa ating pag-iisip. So the locus of control in cognitive behaviors model is very much the teacher or the instructional designer. Ibig sabihin, most of the information are coming from the teacher. Kasi nga, walang direct two-way communication na nangyayari in cognitive behaviors. And kadalasan, most of the information are coming from the teacher. Naggagawa ng spoon feeding yung teacher natin sa mga estudyante. Here is the strength and weaknesses of cognitive behaviorists. For the strength, distance education was able to maximize its reach due to significantly lower cost than conventional education. So sa cognitive behavior, since we are using the postal correspondence, pinapadala lang ng educational institution yung mga learning materials sa estudyante. Therefore, very natitipid yung mga gastos ng institution rather than the conventional education na gumagastos tayo for the operation ng actual campus. For the weaknesses, since tayo nga ay gumagamit ng postal correspondence, teaching and social presence were significantly reduced. Wala masyadong communication between the learner and the educator, or sometimes educator to educator, or the learner to the learner. Cognitive behaviors pedagogy treated the learner as a blank slate. Tinitreat yung bata na parang wala pa siya talagang alam on the topic. Kaya nga ang nangyayari in cognitive behaviors ay nagsuspoon feed si teacher dun sa learner. Next type of pedagogy for distance education is the social constructivist. So the roots of the constructivist model most commonly applied today spring from the work of Vygotsky and Dewey. If you can still remember the social learning theory of Lev Vygotsky, this involves the process of learning from a more knowledgeable other. This may be the parent of the learner or could be a tutor. Sa social learning theory din ni Vygotsky, na-mention lagi doon yung scaffolding, wherein the more knowledgeable other provides guidance sa ating learner until he or she can work independently. Social constructivist pedagogies, perhaps not coincidentally, develop in conjunction with the development of two-way communication technologies. So as compared to cognitive behaviorists, which is a one-way communication, dito sa social constructivists, we are now using two-way communication technologies. Ibig sabihin, this is in the period where an email or the microprocessor was developed. At this time, rather than transmitting information, technology became widely used to create opportunities for both synchronous and asynchronous interactions between and among learners and the teachers. Social constructivist pedagogies acknowledges the social nature of knowledge of its creation in the minds of individual learners. So again, as compared to cognitive behaviors, which treats the learner as a blank slate, dito sa social constructivist, ina-acknowledge na natin na meron na talagang alam yung learner natin. We just have to build upon those experiences. Uh, in the Masters in Distance Education, we have the discussion forum, which utilizes the social constructivist pedagogy. Kasi sa discussion forum, na kapag share tayo ng opinion natin regarding the topics and reports presented by our classmates. Next, we have the themes of social constructivist pedagogy. First, new knowledge is built upon previous learning. So gaya nga ng nabanggit ko, ang ating mga learner ay ina-acknowledge na natin na meron na silang alam, kailangan na lang nating dagdagan or i-enhance yung kaalaman na nila. Unlike in cognitive behaviorists, na tinitreat talaga ang learner na wala pa siyang alam regarding that topic. Context is used in shaping a learner's development. Context is very important in Lev Vygotsky's social learning theory, na ina-acknowledge din natin yung ano yung pinanggalingan ni bata, ano yung mga previous experiences ni bata. And then we can use that to present our topics in a way na mas maiintindihan ng ating learners. Learning is an active process. Ibig sabihin, si teacher is no longer the sage on the stage, pero siya na yung facilitator ng learning natin. Most of the learning is done by the student. Language is used as a tool for knowledge. This is connected to our second theme. Yung context is used in shaping the learner's development. So, uh, just like here in my report, I am using side by side English and Tagalog because I am acknowledging the context of everyone in uh, this course. Kaya ginagamit natin siya para mas mabilis din maintindihan ng iba nating mga kaklase. Metacognition is used to develop learners' capacity to assess their own learning. Metacognition is uh, thinking about thinking. Parang sine-self-assess natin yung sarili natin na paano ba ako natututo, ganyan, or alam ko na ba talaga yung topic. Parang nagagamit natin siya for us to identify if alam na nga natin yung topic. If not, nagagamit din natin yun para mag-initiate tayo ng mga sarili natin to study that topic. The learning environment and perspective of others are considered. Kasi nga, social constructivist na siya, we construct learning through socialization. Yung ating learning environment at yung opinion ng iba ay kinoconsider natin when we are using social constructivist pedagogy. Knowledge is subject to social discussion, validation, and application in the real world. So, hindi man pwedeng yung natutunan mo ay basta alam mo lang. You must use that knowledge in social discussion. Gaya nga din ang ginagawa natin sa discussion forum that we are sharing our own experiences para mapalawak natin yung topic na pre-present ng mga kaklase natin. In addition to this, as a social constructivist pedagogy continued to expand due to two-way communication, distance education evolved as a social activity rather than an individual study. Dun sa cognitive behaviors natin, since we are using postal correspondence na natatanggap ni learner ang lahat ng learning materials, nagiging individual studies or independent study. Dito sa social constructivist, we are now utilizing social activities para makatuto tayo. The teacher now acts as the facilitator of learning, as I have mentioned earlier. Now, the locus of control in a social constructivist system shifts somehow away from the teacher, who now becomes more of a guide rather than an instructor, but still assumes the critical role of shaping the learning activities and designing, of course, the structure of our activities. For the strengths and weaknesses of social constructivists, for the strength, social constructivist pedagogy encapsulated the narrow type of knowledge transmission or yung one-way learning natin or spoon feeding to human communications-based learning. Nagagamit na natin yung socialization natin when it comes to learning. For the weakness, the focus on human interaction was noted by Anand in 1999 to be costly and set limits for accessibility, especially for those with geographic and temporal access. This is still in 1999. That's why we still have limitations for accessibility. Hindi pa ganun kalawak yung uh, technologies natin when it comes to socializing, especially through the internet. Kaya nakalagay dito na very limited yung accessibility ng paggamit ng social constructivists. For example, ako, nakatira ako sa Marinduque and then I have to uh, learn through social constructivist approaches sa mga kaklase ko na nasa Japan, for example. It's going to be very hard na magkameron ng interaction sa amin. Kasi nga hindi pa ganun kalawak yung technologies na ginagamit before. Garrison and others argue that the rich student-student and student-teacher interaction can also be viewed as a post-industrial era of distance education. Our third distance education pedagogy is the connectivist pedagogy. Connectivist learning focuses on building and maintaining network connections that are current and flexible enough to be applied to existing and emergent problems. Dito na pumapasok yung nababanggit ng iba na meron siyang connections, kaya mas mabilis yung kanyang pagkatuto. Connectivism also assumes that information is plentiful kasi nga nakikipag-connect na tayo sa iba, and that the learner's role is not to memorize or understand everything, but to have the capacity to find and apply knowledge when and where it is needed. So hindi na mahalaga sa connectivist pedagogy na alam mo lahat. Ang kailangan lang sa connectivist pedagogy, alam mo kung kailan siya pwedeng gamitin. It is noteworthy that connectivist models explicitly rely on the ubiquity of network connections between people, digital artifacts, and content. So because of the rise of the World Wide Web, yung connectivist presence natin begins that the assumption of our learners ay meron na silang access sa mga powerful networks. And syempre, literate na din sila na makipag-connect sa ibang tao in completing their learning tasks. Nagagamit din natin itong connectivist pedagogy sa ating discussion forum na in our introduction posts, nalalaman na agad natin ano yung merong network itong tao na ito. How can I use this network para mapalawak din yung network ko? Ganyan. That's why the first task of connectivist education or connectivist pedagogy involves exposing the students to network and providing them all the possible opportunities for them to have a sense of self-efficacy and network-based cognitive skills in the process of developing their own network. Ayan, kaya itong connectivist pedagogy natin, this can highly be associated with the rise of the World Wide Web. Next is the strengths and weaknesses of connectivist pedagogy. First, for the strength, because connectivist pedagogy still uses scaffolding na ginagamit din in social constructivism. Learners are still able to meet their desired needs and context despite their diverse background. Gaya nga nung nabanggit natin sa context ng connectivist pedagogy na hindi mahalaga kung gaano karami yung alam mo, dapat ay alam mo lang kung kailan mo siya pwedeng gamitin. That's why in connectivist pedagogy, if makipag-connect tayo, kumari, to our classmates, pinipili lang natin kung ano yung dapat nating ma-share sa kanila depending on their needs. For the weaknesses of connectivist pedagogy, learning in a connectivist environment can be plagued by a lack of connection. Kaya nga, kung wala masyadong maraming connection yung ating learner, may hirapan siya in accomplishing learning tasks in a connectivist environment. Structure is unevenly distributed. Ibig sabihin, kapag mas marami kang connections, mas nandun ka sa taas. This is mentioned in our third weakness na in a formal setting, charismatic and popular network leaders are often placed at the top and they become the sources of information. Kasi nga, in a collectivist pedagogy, mahalaga ang network mo. Kung mas marami kang network, mas marami yung pwede ka makapag-exchange ng information. Kaya yung mga learners na wala masyadong connection, nandun sila sa baba, and they rely mostly on those at the top, yung mga popular network leaders nga natin. So when scaled down and superimposed over a formal teaching pattern, connectivist approaches require a great deal of energy, of course, on the part of the central connector to actively maintain this network. So itong nabanggit natin na require great deal of energy, kasama na din dito yung pagiging literate natin in using various technologies para makapag-connect tayo sa iba. So, in conclusion, technology serves as a precursor to the evolution of distance education pedagogies. We must also again remember that distance education pedagogies were not displaced by newer pedagogies, but rather built upon them. No single pedagogy was able to provide solutions to concerns of distance education. If you can still remember sa ating cognitive behaviorist, napalawak yung network napalawak yung capacity ng ating mga educational institutions to reach learners. Pero ang problema doon ay wala masyadong communication between the student and the student and the educator. In the social constructivist, nagkaroon nga tayo ng two-way communication between the educator and the students. Pero very costly naman ang nangyari when we are utilizing social uh, constructivist pedagogy. In the connectivist naman, even if we are socializing at nagagamit na din natin yung different technologies natin kasi nasa newer eras na itong connectivist theory, ang problema naman dito ay hindi equally distributed yung learning among the learners. Kasi nga, those who have uh, higher connections or bigger networks, they are placed at the top, and those with lower connections are placed at the bottom. This is a table summary of the pedagogies that I have discussed. So for the technology, our cognitive behaviorist uses mass media, print, TV, one-to-one communication. Social constructivist uses conferencing like Zoom and Google Meet. Connectivism now uses social networks. For learning activities and cognitive behaviorism, ang ginagawa lang ng learner dito ay nagbabasa at nanonood. Sa constructivist, nagdi-discuss at nagko-construct na ng learning based from their connections, yung mga bata. Connectivism naman, mahalaga ang pag-explore at pag-connect sa ibang tao. Sino ba ang involved sa cognitive behaviorism? It's only the individual. Wala na siyang ibang pwedeng masako. Kasi nga, meron lang tayong one-way communication. For constructivists, this is in a group. In connectivist, uh, in constructivist, this is in the group. Connectivist, tayo naman ay meron ng networks. For content granularity sa cognitive behaviorism, it's very fine kasi piling-pili na lang yung pwede nating ituro dun sa mga bata. This was utilized in the pandemic year by the Department of Education na gumamit na talang tayo ng most essential learning competencies. Piling-pili na yung pwede nating ituro sa bata at yung alam lang natin na magagamit nila. For social constructivism, it's in the medium granularity. Kasi nga gumagamit naman tayo ng scaffolding at yun naman ay ina-arrange din ni teacher or ni educator kung ano yung uh, mga pwedeng pag-usapan ng mga bata. For connectivism, it's very coarse kasi napakalawak ng pwedeng mapag-usapan in networks. Kaya, gaya ng nabanggit natin kanina in the context of connectivist pedagogy, pili lang yung sinishare natin sa iba depending on the needs of the learner. So for the evaluation of cognitive behaviorist pedagogy, recall lang yung ginagamit natin. Yun yung nagtatanong lang si teacher, sumasagot si bata. Sa constructivism naman, tayo ay gumagawa na ng mga essays kasi gumagamit na din tayo ng ating experiences in learning dito sa social constructivist pedagogy. In connectivism, we are creating artifacts naman, and this is one way of evaluating learning. Role naman ni teachers in cognitive behaviorism, sa kanya lahat. He or she is the sage on the stage. Siya yung nagpo-provide ng information, siya na din yung nag-explain ng information. For social constructivist pedagogy, nagkakaroon na nga tayo ng discussion with others. At si teacher ay nagiging guide on the side na lang, nagiging facilitator of learning. For connectivism, si teacher ay nagiging critical friend na natin. Kasi nagagamit natin yung networks natin to connect with other networks na meron naman si teacher or other students. Scalability of cognitive behaviorism, it's very high, gaya ng nabanggit natin kanina. Mataas ang scalability ng cognitive behaviorist pedagogy kasi mababa din ang cost niya. For constructivism, mababa ang ating scalability because we are in groups. In connectivism naman, it's in a medium level kasi nakadepende pa rin tayo kung sino yung mga pwede nating lapitan na networks depending again on our needs. So these are the references that I have used for this report. And for our points for discussion, our first uh, point for discussion is the three learning pedagogies of distance education are also notably used in the conventional face-to-face classes here in the Philippines, and we have uh, used them uh, through the same processes of instruction. Despite this, the Department of Education only utilized distance education modalities in times of crisis like the pandemic, especially the cognitive behaviors pedagogy. What do you think are the reasons why our basic education level cannot fully implement distance education pedagogies? Next, as I have mentioned earlier, the three learning pedagogies are embedded in the teaching learning process of distance education. Despite the evolution of technology, we are just building upon the previous pedagogies. Nonetheless, do you think one of these pedagogies are often used than the other two? If so, which one of these pedagogies are most commonly used and why? So that is it. That is the additional report from my previous report. This is on the distance education pedagogies through the generations. Again, I am Sir Kyle David B. Atienza. I am very much excited to read again your responses for my points of discussion, and I'm also very much willing to help to provide clarifications for any points for improvement in my report. Thank you so much.